The city had survived the war. That was not nothing. By the spring of 1945, survival was not something that could be assumed for German cities. The bombing campaigns of the preceding years had reduced some of them, Hamburg, Dresden, Cologne, to landscapes of rubble that bore almost no resemblance to the places that had existed before the war. Others had been fought through street by street, building by building, in the grinding attritional combat that the final phase of the European war had produced. The ones that had come through with their essential structure intact had done so largely by accident, by geography, by the timing of the Allied advance, by the specific calculations of the air campaign planners about what was worth bombing and what was not. Not intact, not without scars. The Allied bombing campaigns had left their marks on it, as they had left their marks on every major urban center in Germany, but the old quarter was standing, the churches were standing, the bridges were standing. The centuries of accumulated human life that had been built into the streets and the buildings and the infrastructure of a living city were, against the odds of what the war had done to Europe, still there. And then the German commander announced that he was going to destroy it, not as a last desperate act of a garrison being overrun, not as the spontaneous decision of a man in the final hours of a siege with no options left, as a deliberate premeditated threat issued in advance with enough specificity that it was clear he had thought about it and was prepared to follow through. If the Americans advanced, he would detonate the demolition charges that had been placed throughout the city's key infrastructure. The bridges would go, the water system would go, the historic center would go. What the war had not destroyed, he would destroy himself, rather than hand it to the enemy undamaged. The threat reached Eisenhower. What Eisenhower did with it was not what the commander expected. It was not a negotiation, it was not a warning, it was not the kind of measured diplomatic response that the situation, viewed from a distance, might seem to call for. It was a message, and the message had one point. If you destroy that city, I will hold you personally responsible for every building, every bridge, and every life. Not as a matter of military convention, as a matter of what I will make it my specific business to ensure happens to you after this war is over. This is the story of how that message was delivered, what it was based on, and why it worked. The city in question was one of several that faced this situation in the final weeks of the war in Europe. The pattern was consistent enough to constitute a German policy, or at least a German tendency. It was a pattern that Eisenhower's staff had been tracking as the advance pushed into Germany in the spring of 1945. The intelligence reports that crossed his desk in those weeks contained, with increasing frequency, assessments of German commanders who were threatening demolition, who had placed charges, who were waiting for orders or for the arrival of Allied forces to provide the trigger. Some of them were bluffing, some were not. The difficulty was that the ones who were not tended to look, from the outside, very similar to the ones who were. The only way to determine which category a given commander fell into was to test the threat, and testing the threat meant advancing and watching what happened, and what happened if the commander was not bluffing was that the city was gone. Eisenhower was not interested in that test. As Allied forces closed in on German cities in the spring of 1945, some German commanders, operating under Hitler's Nero decree of March 19, 1945, which ordered the destruction of all military, industrial, transport, and communication infrastructure on German soil to deny it to the advancing enemy, chose to interpret their orders broadly, very broadly, broadly enough to include the historic centers of cities that had been inhabited by German civilians for centuries. The Nero Decree was Hitler's final statement on the relationship between the German people and their leadership. Signed on March 19, 1945, it ordered the destruction of all military, industrial, transport, and communication infrastructure on German soil as Allied forces advanced. The name it acquired, the Nero Decree, was not the official title. It was what the German public and the German military began to call it, in the way that people name things that reveal something uncomfortable about the people who issued them. Nero, the Roman emperor who allegedly played music while Rome burned. The comparison was not flattering, and it was not intended to be. The decree was, at its core, a declaration that a Germany that could not win did not deserve to survive. It was a declaration that a Germany that could not win did not deserve to survive. It was the logical endpoint of an ideology that had always treated human beings as instruments of historical forces rather than as people with their own lives and their own futures. Most German commanders, by the spring of 1945, were not enthusiastic about implementing it. They had been fighting a losing war for long enough to have developed a certain pragmatic distance from the more extreme expressions of the ideology they had been serving. But some of them were true believers, and some of them were men who had built their careers on a particular kind of ruthless professionalism that expressed itself in total compliance with orders regardless of what the orders required. The commander threatening the city was one of the latter. He had the charges in place, he had the detonators, he had the authority, under the Nero decree, to give the order. What he was waiting for was the American advance that would provide the trigger. Eisenhower's response reached him before the advance did. The channel exists for exactly this, the moments where the official record gives you the outcome but not the conversation that produced it, the decision that didn't appear in any dispatch but shaped what happened next. If you've been watching and haven't subscribed yet, hit that button now, turn on the bell, and when this video is done, drop a comment telling us which city you think this was about, or what you already know about the Nero decree. Every comment gets read. Now, back to the message. And back to what was in it. The message Eisenhower sent was not a negotiation, because Eisenhower did not negotiate with threats to civilian infrastructure. This was a position he had held consistently throughout the campaign, and that was grounded in something more specific than the general principles of the laws of war. He had been to Ardruff. He had walked through the camp on April 12, 1945, 5 weeks before Germany's surrender, and he had seen what happened when a regime decided that the people it was supposed to protect were instead instruments to be used or destroyed according to its requirements. He had looked at what was in the buildings and on the ground, and he had decided, in the way that Eisenhower made decisions, that he was not going to look away from it, and that he was not going to allow anyone else to look away from it either. He had ordered American units to come through the camp. He had invited journalists and members of Congress. He had written to Marshall in terms that stripped away the official language and described the reality of it directly, because he had already concluded that someday someone was going to say it had not happened, and he wanted there to be witnesses who could contradict them. He had spent weeks in the spring of 1945 looking at the evidence of what the Nazi regime had produced in the places it had controlled, and what he had seen had given him a very specific understanding of what the threat to destroy the city actually represented. It was not a military decision. It was not a legitimate act of war in any sense that the laws of war, strained as they were by the events of this particular conflict, could accommodate. It was the expression of an ideology that had produced Ohrdruf and Auschwitz and Treblinka, and the systematic destruction of everything that could not be instrumentalized for the regime's purposes. Eisenhower was not going to treat it as a military problem to be managed with the tools of military negotiation. He was going to treat it as what it was. A crime being announced in advance by a specific person whose name and rank and location were known. The message he sent said exactly that. It said that the destruction of civilian infrastructure was not covered by the Nero decree in any interpretation that would survive the scrutiny of a post-war tribunal. It said that the specific targeting of historic and civilian areas constituted a war crime under the laws of war as they had been understood since at least the Hague Conventions of 1907. It said that the commander issuing the threat was not protected by the orders he had received, because orders to commit war crimes did not constitute a legal defense. It said that Eisenhower had already been in contact with the legal officers who were building the cases that would be tried at Nuremberg. This was not a bluff. The work of documenting what the Nazi regime had done, the crimes, the perpetrators, the chains of command that connected the orders to the outcomes, was already well advanced by the spring of 1945. The teams of lawyers and investigators who would eventually prosecute the cases at Nuremberg were already in the theater. The evidence was already being assembled, catalogued, placed on the record. Eisenhower had been contributing to that record since Ohrdruf. He understood what it was building toward, that the files were being assembled, that the evidence was being documented, that the men who had given and executed the orders that produced the camps and the massacres and the systematic destruction of occupied Europe were being identified and their actions were being placed on the record. It said that if the city was destroyed, the commander's name would be on that record, not as a soldier who had followed orders under difficult circumstances, as a man who had announced his intention to commit a war crime and then committed it. And then it said the thing that was, in the specific circumstances of April and May 1945, the most persuasive thing it could have said. It said that the war was ending, that Germany was going to surrender within weeks. That the question before every German commander was not whether the Allies were going to win, but what kind of Germany was going to exist after they did. That a Germany whose cities had been handed over intact, whose civilian infrastructure had been preserved, whose people had been protected by their own commanders in the final weeks of a war that was already lost, that Germany had a better future than the alternative. and that a commander who destroyed his city in the final days of a lost war was not going to be remembered as a soldier who had done his duty. He was going to be remembered as the man who burned it down. The commander did not detonate the charges. The city survived. The accounts of this specific exchange and the specific city it concerned are embedded in the broader record of the final weeks of the war in Europe in ways that make attribution complicated. Several German cities faced versions of this situation in April and May of 1945. Several German commanders received versions of this message through various channels, some of them direct from Eisenhower's headquarters and some of them relayed through intermediaries. The pattern was consistent enough that it constituted something like a policy, even if it was never formally written down as one. What was consistent across all of them was the approach, not negotiation, not the pretense that there was something to discuss about whether civilian infrastructure was an appropriate target, not the professional military courtesy that Eisenhower extended to German commanders who had fought according to the rules and lost. A precise, factual account of what destruction would cost the man contemplating it, measured not in military terms, but in the specific legal and historical currency that was becoming increasingly valuable as the war moved toward its end and the machinery of post-war accountability began to take shape. Eisenhower understood by the spring of 1945 that the war was producing a record that was going to matter for a very long time after the shooting stopped. He had been helping to build that record since Ohrdruf. He had insisted on witnesses. He had invited the press and the politicians and the members of parliament. He had written to George Marshall in terms that stripped away the official distance and described what was actually there. He understood that the record was the most powerful tool available in the final weeks of the campaign. More powerful, in the specific situation of a German commander weighing whether to execute a demolition order than any military threat. The military threat was binary, advance or hold, apply force or do not. The record was something else. The record was permanent. The record followed a person not just through the remainder of the war, but through the years and decades after it, through the trials and the denazification proceedings and the long historical reckoning that was already visibly taking shape. A German commander in April 1945, who was trying to calculate his future, had to account for both. The military threat was immediate and survivable. Most garrison commanders who surrendered were treated according to the conventions and survived the war. The record was longer and less forgiving. A name on the wrong list, attached to the wrong decision, placed in the wrong context by the documentation that was being assembled with increasing efficiency as the Allied advance moved through Germany, that was a different kind of consequence from a brief period of captivity. Not the military record, the legal and historical record, the documentation of who had done what, in what order, on whose authority, with what foreknowledge. The German commander threatening the city understood, when the message arrived, that he was now part of that record, that his name was in it, that his threat had been noted and documented and placed alongside the evidence that was being assembled for the trials that were coming. He understood that the war he was in was not just a military contest anymore, it was also a legal one. And the legal one was not going to end with a surrender ceremony. It was going to end in a courtroom, and in that courtroom, the question of whether he had destroyed his city in the final days of a lost war was going to be asked and answered and attached to his name permanently. He stood down. Not immediately. The accounts of these situations describe a period of hours or days between the delivery of the message and the decision that confirmed the charges would not be used. The time was spent, presumably, in the specific kind of calculation that a man makes when he is weighing his immediate military obligation against his longer-term survival, and when the weight on one side of the scale has just been made significantly heavier by a message from a supreme commander who has made clear that he knows your name. The charges were not detonated, the bridges were not blown. The historic center of the city survived the final weeks of the war and was handed to the Allied forces intact, or as intact as the preceding years of the conflict had left it. The city that survived is part of a larger story that the immediate post-war period did not fully tell and that the decades since have not always told clearly. The story of the German cities that did not burn in the final weeks of the war, the ones where the demolition orders were given and not executed, or threatened and then withdrawn, or where the garrison commanders made the individual decision that the war was over and the destruction served nothing except the ideology of a regime that was already collapsing, is a story with many threads. Eisenhower's message was one of them, not the only one. There were German officers who made the same decision without any message from Allied headquarters. There were local officials who defied their own commanders. there were ordinary soldiers who refused to place the charges or to connect the detonators. The preservation of what was preserved in those weeks was the product of many individual decisions made by many different people for many different reasons. But the message mattered. It mattered because it changed the calculation. It made explicit what had previously been implicit, that the conduct of German commanders in the final weeks of the war was going to be part of the post-war record, and that the post-war record was going to have consequences. What Eisenhower had done was not unique to this one exchange. It was the same thing he had done in the room with Ramke after the fall of Brest, the same thing he had done in the minutes after Jodl's surrender in Reims, the same thing he had done every time the end of the fighting threatened to produce the comfortable fiction that the war had been a contest between two military establishments that had now concluded their business with appropriate formalities. He kept inserting the accounting, not because inserting it was comfortable or because it produced the smooth professional relationships that the management of an alliance and an occupation required. It was not comfortable. It produced friction. It produced the specific kind of friction that results when one person in a room refuses to accept the frame that everyone else is operating within and insists on substituting a different one. The frame everyone else was operating within, in the final weeks of the war and the months after, was the professional military frame. The war is over. Soldiers fought on both sides. The winners extend the courtesies of the conventions to the losers. The accounting is done by the legal teams and the historians and the tribunals, and everyone else can move on to the business of reconstruction and occupation. Eisenhower kept refusing that frame wherever the evidence required it. The cost measured fully in the people who had paid it. The responsibility assigned specifically to the people who had incurred it. The record maintained against the natural tendency of time and distance to blur the edges of even the most significant events. He kept inserting it, not because he had a policy that required it, because he had been to Ordruf, because he had seen what happened when the accounting was not done, because he understood, better than almost anyone in his position, that the difference between a world in which the war's outcomes were fully reckoned with and a world in which they were not, was not an abstract historical question. It was the question of what kind of world came next. The city survived. The commander's name is in the record. The record is still there. That is what Eisenhower said to the Nazi commander who threatened to destroy the city, not with a gun, not with a threat of military force, though the military force was there and available and would have been used if the situation had required it, with a message. A precise, factual, documented message that placed one commander's threatened action in the context of a post-war world that was already being built around the documentation of exactly these kinds of decisions. He told him the war was not over yet. Not the shooting was almost done. The armies were closing in from east and west, and the arithmetic of the military situation left almost no room for an outcome other than the one that was coming. But the other war, the war over the record, over what had happened and who had done it, and what it was going to mean for the people who had done it, that war was in its early days. Eisenhower had been fighting it since Ordruf. He was going to keep fighting it for as long as it needed to be fought. The city survived. The commander's name is in the record. The record is still there, not the shooting. That was almost done. The accounting, that was just beginning.